if I can find them. The ones that are talking about the type 1 error and the type 2 error.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you had a better way of explaining the difference or what you're looking for.
Right. Okay. Let me pick control again. Try my best to. Yeah. What we're looking at here is that hypothesis test, like every other test, it isn't perfect, right? There are going to be situations where you make the wrong decision. You did it for all the right reasons, right? You followed the process and the process said, right, do what you want to do. So I'm going to call this, you got it right and you got it wrong. And then you have up here that you reject the null hypothesis or you don't reject it. That's just the language that we typically use. Now, each one of these boxes represents one of 4 situations that could happen in any hypothesis test. So let's have a kind of, here's the population, right? And let's pretend that the true value, right, was 0.3, right? And we had a null hypothesis that went and said it was 0.3. And we had an alternate hypothesis, let's just say for argument, it was greater than 0.3. Now, you collect some data and you get a p-hat. And your p-hat is whatever it is, and eventually you get a p-value. And depends on how small that p-value is that you will decide to reject H0. So let's see what you could get. Let's suppose you had a p-value, just for argument's sake, of 0.03, right? Now, if it was, oh, right, I guess. Where in these boxes are the errors? Well, if you reject H0 and you got it right, that's not an error. If you got it wrong, this is an error. Right? You rejected the null hypothesis, but you got it wrong, right? That would be an error. And you don't reject it, and that's right, or over here, you have an error. And these are the errors that they call type 1 and type 2. Now, in a hypothesis test, type 1 error is the same number as the significance level. So if you had a question and it gave you a whole story and it said, is there enough evidence to prove that P is greater than 0.3 and the significance level was that, then you could say in general, your type 1 error would be 0.03 or at least up to and including alpha's value. And the other kind of error is that you don't reject H0 when really you should, right? So you're wrong in that case. And we talked about them and they're called type 2. Now that's kind of generic because I tried to make it that way. So here's a kind of situation that might help a little bit. I suppose we're looking at types of a disease, a test. Let's suppose we're doing a test for HIV. And this is what we say, right? This is what the test says. And down here, this is going to be the truth. Now, the test says you've got HIV, or it says you don't. Isn't that the way a lot of disease tests work, right? You've got COVID or you don't. You've got HIV antibodies or you don't, right? You've got malaria or you don't, right? That's kind of what tests for diseases do. And the truth is, you have HIV or you don't have HIV. Well, each one of these boxes tells me something. If the test says I've got HIV and I have HIV, isn't that a true statement? The test got it right. If the test says I don't have HIV and the truth is I don't have HIV, that's the truth. Do you see these two boxes are mistakes? This one, the test says you don't have HIV, but you do, right? In the medical world, isn't that called a false positive? In our world, that is a type 1 error. You know what they call this mistake? Where they say you've got HIV and in reality you don't, right? The test just got it wrong. In the medical world, if this is called a false positive, do you know what this error is called? It's
False
called
negative.
correct. So if you're in the medical world, you've probably heard these terms. And there's our type 2 error. So can you see that when you do a test, think of this as null hypothesis alternate. You got it right or you got it wrong. Can you see how there's a 2 where everything's great and 2 where everything isn't so great, right? 2 are the errors. And a type 1 error is alpha and a type 2 is typically called beta. So here is yet another way of thinking of a type 1. You reject H0 when you shouldn't. That's a type 1 error. So you do a hypothesis test and you reject this fella and you say this guy, right? And we tend to describe these things in terms of what happened to H0. So you rejected the null hypothesis when you shouldn't. And a type 2 error is when you failed to reject H0 when you should have. So that would be the real answer was 0.4, but you never found enough evidence to prove that it was bigger than 0.3, right? So that would be a mistake, right? You didn't find the truth. So a type 1 error, reject H0 when you shouldn't, that is our significance level alpha. And this guy here is a guy that's typically called beta. And you'll find that there are other terms called the power of a test, 1 minus beta and so on, right? Now, let's go back up here. There are 2 types of error, right? False positive, false negative. You might think they're both equally bad, but that isn't always the case. If I was doing a medical test for HIV, I would put more weight on the false positive than I would be putting on the false negative. A false positive is very dangerous. Let's get that right. Back to front. A false negative is very dangerous. Try to get my thoughts kind of clear in my head. If someone has HIV, but you tell them that they don't, right? Can you see that that is really bad? Because 1 is they're not getting treatment, and 2 is because they think there's nothing wrong, and they may infect someone. Right? Now, what about getting a false negative? Well, if you went in and you got an HIV test, let's say the other way around. Suppose you don't have HIV and they tell you that you do, right? That's a false positive, right? If they told you that, yeah, that's bad. But isn't the bad just stress? Oh God, I've got HIV, I could die. What am I going to do with my life? You know, some really horrible thoughts we get to you. But you don't actually have HIV, right? The test just said it, right? So you can imagine in that situation, right, you could live with the consequences, because all they would do is come in and do other tests and find out, oh, sorry about that. We thought you had cancer, but you don't, right? We thought you had malaria, but you don't really. We thought you had HIV, but you don't really. So when we are looking at hypothesis tests, we're thinking about the two kinds of error, the type 1 and the type 2. Think of type 1 as this story, and type 2 is this one. And then